Naomi Williams walked into the small town courtroom with a mix of frustration and quiet determination, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. She could feel the eyes of the people in the room on her. Even though she had been here countless times before, today felt different. There was something about the air in this courtroom, the way the light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the wooden benches, the way the judge sat high above the room, as if he could look down on everyone with complete authority. She knew him, of course, Judge Thomas Caldwell, the kind of man whose reputation preceded him, a man who valued rules over everything, a man who believed the law was meant to be upheld strictly no matter the circumstance, no matter the person standing before him. She had seen his demeanor in action before, but today it felt colder, harsher. Somehow she couldn't shake the feeling that this would be different. Naomi was here today for what should have been a simple case, a minor traffic violation that had spiraled out of control, the kind of thing that should have been easily dismissed with a small fine. But as she stood there in front of Judge Caldwell, she felt the weight of his gaze more than ever. She could tell he wasn't looking at her as a person, but as another defendant, another case to be handled quickly and efficiently. He didn't know her story. He didn't know the struggles she had faced to get here, the countless obstacles she had overcome just to stand in this very courtroom today. He only saw her as a black woman in a system that had often failed people like her. But she had fought too hard to let that stop her. She had always believed in fighting for what was right, even when it seemed like the odds were stacked against her. The judge called the case to order, and Naomi stepped forward with a steady breath. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but she refused to show any sign of weakness. She knew the importance of this moment. The words she would speak today could mean the difference between a hefty fine and a dismissal. But as she spoke, she felt her words falling on deaf ears. Judge Caldwell's expression remained stoic, his eyes cold and calculating, as he listened to her explain the circumstances surrounding the violation. She spoke about the confusion, the miscommunication, the reason she had been caught in this situation, but it felt like she was speaking into an abyss. When the judge finally spoke, his decision was swift and final. A fine that would take a significant portion of her savings to cover. Naomi's chest tightened and her hands clenched into fists. She tried to remain calm, but something inside her snapped. This wasn't just about the fine, it was about something deeper, something more personal. She could feel the unfairness of it all swirling around her. As she stood there, she had been judged and found lacking by a man who didn't know her, who didn't understand her struggle. But what was worse was the realization that this wasn't a one-time incident. This was the system she had been fighting against for years, the same system that treated people like her as invisible. As she walked out of the courtroom, the anger and frustration welled up inside her like a storm ready to break. She had to hold it together, not for herself, but for the work she was doing, the change she was trying to create. But as the door closed behind her, she couldn't help but feel that the world had just dealt her another cruel blow. Naomi stepped out of the courtroom into the bright afternoon sun, her eyes squinting against the light. As she tried to clear her mind of the chaos she had just experienced, the fine wasn't the only thing that lingered with her. It was the feeling of helplessness, the way the judge had looked at her, not as a person with a story, but as just another defendant to be processed quickly and efficiently. She had seen it before in the eyes of others, but something about the way Caldwell had delivered his verdict made it feel more personal. The sharpness of his decision felt like a judgment on her very existence. She walked briskly down the street, her mind racing with thoughts of how to move forward. She wasn't new to hardship. She had spent her life fighting for what she believed in, advocating for the voiceless and standing up against a system that was stacked against people like her. But today it felt different. The anger was burning inside her, not just at the fine, but at the entire structure that allowed this to happen over and over again. She thought about the hundreds of times she had seen black people caught in the web of an unjust system, the disproportionate punishments, the unequal treatment. It was as if no matter how hard they tried, the system was always there to remind them of their place. Naomi couldn't let this go, not today, not after everything she had fought for over the years. She had been writing about these injustices for months, pouring her heart and soul into a book that examined the intersection of race, justice, and personal experience, but she had never felt this strongly about it until now. The words on the page had always come easy to her, but today they seemed to burn with an intensity she couldn't ignore. The fine wasn't just a fine, It was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system, and Naomi was determined to make it right. She took a deep breath as she entered her apartment, her mind still swirling with the events of the day. But as she closed the door behind her, a sense of clarity washed over her. She couldn't change what had happened in the courtroom, but she could control what came next. She could find a way to turn this anger into something meaningful, something that could make a difference. She grabbed her laptop and opened her manuscript for the book she had been co-writing with Judge Caldwell. Naomi had met the judge months earlier at a local writers group. He was an unexpected partner, someone she had never imagined collaborating with. He had a reputation for being tough and unyielding in his judgments, but something about the way he spoke about the law intrigued her. They began meeting regularly, discussing their shared passion for writing and justice. What started as an intellectual partnership quickly grew into a deeper connection as they shared personal stories and experiences. It was the first time Naomi had ever felt truly heard by someone in a position of power, and she found herself respecting Caldwell for his willingness to listen and learn. But today, everything felt different. How could she continue working with him after he had just treated her like any other defendant in his court? She hesitated for a moment, staring at the screen, as the words she had written with him seemed to taunt her. The collaboration that had felt so natural now felt like a betrayal. How could she continue to work with someone who had so easily dismissed her value? She wasn't sure if she could do it. But as she thought about the work they had already done together, she realized that she couldn't just give up on it. She had to confront him. But how would she do it? Could she trust him again after what had just happened? Naomi sat in her small apartment that evening, staring at the flashing cursor on her laptop screen. The words she had written with Judge Caldwell now felt distant, almost foreign to her. She had spent hours crafting their shared manuscript, but now it was like a reminder of something broken between them. She couldn't escape the way he had looked at her in the courtroom, his stern gaze a reminder of the unyielding authority he held over people like her. It wasn't just about the fine, it was the way he saw her and all people like her as just another case, another number in the system that was supposed to serve justice, but in reality often left people feeling invisible and powerless. Naomi closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, letting out a heavy sigh. She tried to shake off the frustration that clung to her like a weight, but it was impossible. She knew she couldn't keep pretending everything was fine, not after today, not after what had happened in that courtroom. She needed answers. She needed to confront him, but she didn't know how to even begin. She couldn't ignore the bond they had formed through their writing. It was more than just a professional partnership. It was a rare connection between two people who had learned from one another, shared their vulnerabilities, and trusted each other with their ideas. But now that trust felt shattered. She knew she couldn't keep working on the manuscript without addressing the elephant in the room, but the thought of confronting Judge Caldwell made her stomach turn. Would he even understand what she was feeling? Would he dismiss her concerns as overblown? Would he even care that his actions had hurt her in such a personal way? As the evening stretched on, Naomi wrestled with herself back and forth between anger and a deep sense of betrayal. The judge was someone who had shown her a side of himself that few others ever saw. He had opened up to her in ways that made her believe he was different from the rest. But now she questioned everything. Had it all just been an act? Had she been naive to think that someone like him could ever truly understand her experience as a Black woman living in a system that often overlooked her humanity? The following day, Naomi went to the library for their regular writing meeting. Despite her reservations about seeing him again, she couldn't avoid it any longer. She had to face him and figure out if their partnership could survive this moment or if it was doomed to fall apart. Before it had even fully begun, when she walked into the library, she saw him sitting at their usual table, flipping through a stack of papers, his glasses perched on the edge of his nose. He looked up when she entered, his eyes immediately locking with hers, a mixture of surprise and concern crossing his face. "Naomi," he said with a forced smile, "you're early today." His tone was awkward, as though he wasn't sure how to approach her after what had happened. Naomi stopped just short of the table. She could feel her heart racing. The words she wanted to say were caught in her throat, but she couldn't hold them back any longer. She crossed her arms and looked directly at him. "We need to talk, Thomas," she said, her voice steady but firm. Judge Caldwell's smile faded as he pushed his papers aside and sat back in his chair. "What's on your mind?" he asked carefully, his eyes never leaving hers. Naomi took a deep breath before speaking again. You find me yesterday in your courtroom, she said, simply, her voice betraying the frustration she had been holding inside. I understand that it's your job, but I can't help but feel betrayed. Caldwell's expression softened, and for a moment he looked genuinely surprised, as if he hadn't fully processed the weight of his own actions. Naomi, He started, but Naomi held up her hand, cutting him off. You didn't even see me as a person yesterday, she said, her voice gaining strength. You saw me as another case, another number, and that's the problem with the system, and I thought you understood that, but clearly I was wrong. The words hung in the air between them as Caldwell looked down at the table, his fingers drumming nervously on the surface. He had always prided himself on being fair, but now he was realizing that fairness wasn't enough. It wasn't just about the law. It was about empathy. It was about understanding the people who came before him as human beings with their own struggles, their own stories. Naomi stood there waiting for him to respond, her chest tight with emotion. She had poured her heart into this project and into their partnership, but now she was questioning everything she had believed about him. Could he really change? Could he truly see things from her perspective? Or was he just another person in power who would never fully understand what it meant to be her? The silence between Naomi and Judge Caldwell was thick, almost unbearable. She stood across from him, her arms still crossed tightly, her eyes unwavering, waiting for him to say something, anything to acknowledge what had just transpired. Caldwell, on the other hand, looked like he had been struck dumb, unsure of how to respond to the depth of Naomi's pain. For a long moment he said nothing, his eyes scanning the table in front of him, as if the answers he needed could somehow be found in the scattered pages of their manuscript. Naomi shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her patience thinning. She had waited long enough to confront him. The anger had been boiling inside her ever since the courtroom, and now it felt like she couldn't hold it back any longer. She had to say it, and she had to say it now. I don't think I can continue working with you, Thomas, she said quietly, her voice surprisingly calm despite the storm inside her. The words hung in the air, and she could see the shock in his eyes. It wasn't just the sting of her rejection. It was the disbelief that she would even think of walking away from their partnership. Caldwell looked up at her, his expression faltering for a moment. Naomi, I don't know what you're saying, he said, his voice faltering slightly. What do you mean? We've come so far with this project. Don't, Naomi interrupted, cutting him off before he could finish. I'm not talking about the project. I'm talking about everything that led up to this moment. You find me, Thomas. You. Her voice broke, but she quickly composed herself. You didn't even see me, did you? Not as a person. Not as someone who is fighting against the system every single day. I'm just another case to you. Another number. And that's what hurts the most. Caldwell looked down, his face slowly reddening, guilt rising within him like a tide he couldn't fight. He could feel the weight of Naomi's words pressing down on him, heavier than any sentence he had ever handed down in court. But he didn't know how to fix this. How could he? How could he make it right? He had always believed in the law, in its impartiality, in its ability to serve justice without bias. But now, Naomi's words were making him question everything he had stood for. I didn't know it was you, he said, his voice low, almost apologetic. I swear, Naomi, I didn't know it was you in that courtroom. It wasn't personal. It was just. Naomi shook her head. It doesn't matter. It's not just about the fine. It's about everything you represent. You're supposed to be someone who sees the humanity in people, but I didn't see any of that yesterday. You didn't even try to understand, and I can't just ignore that. I can't pretend like this partnership means anything if you don't see me for who I am. Caldwell opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. Naomi wasn't sure if he was struggling to find the right words or if he was simply realizing the extent of his actions. He had always prided himself on being a fair judge, someone who saw the law as an equalizer. But now, sitting across from Naomi, he realized that his rigid belief in the law had blinded him to the real human cost of his decisions. There was a long pause, and Naomi finally sighed, the weight of the moment pressing on her chest. I'm not saying I'm done with the project, Thomas, but I need to know that you understand, that you get why this matters, why what happened yesterday matters. Her voice softened, and she felt a glimmer of vulnerability slip through the cracks of her anger. I need to know that you're not just a judge in a courtroom, but a person who can see the bigger picture. Someone who can stand with me, not against me." Judge Caldwell sat there for a long time, his eyes downcast. Naomi waited, holding her breath, unsure of what would come next. She had never expected to feel so torn, so conflicted. The man who had been her partner, her confidant in writing, now seemed like a stranger. But she also couldn't ignore the fact that he was trying to reach her, trying to understand. "I want to understand, Naomi," Caldwell finally said, his voice quiet but sincere. "I need to understand. Help me." Naomi nodded slowly, her arms uncrossing as she took a step closer. There was still a long road ahead, but maybe, just maybe, they could start moving down it together. Naomi took a deep breath, her fingers twitching at her sides as she tried to steady herself. She had not expected to feel this exhausted after speaking her truth, but now, standing in front of Caldwell, the weight of the past few days seemed to press down even harder. She had confronted him, laid bare the anger she had carried with her for so long, but she couldn't help but wonder if it had been enough. Could they really move past the events of the courtroom? Could she trust him again? Caldwell, for his part, sat silently, processing Naomi's words. His brow furrowed, his fingers tapping gently on the table as though trying to absorb everything she had said. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Naomi could feel the tension between them thick and palpable, like a barrier that neither of them knew how to break down. "I can't promise that everything's going to change overnight," he said finally, his voice slow and deliberate. "I've spent my entire career believing in the law, believing that if I follow the rules, things will work out the way they're supposed to. But I realize now that following the rules isn't always enough. Sometimes the rules are broken before they even begin, and it's the people who are affected that suffer." Naomi's heart skipped a beat. She had heard people say they wanted to change, but rarely did she believe them. Too many times, promises of change had been empty, words thrown around without any real substance behind them. But Caldwell's words felt different. They felt real, like he was actually trying to understand what she had been trying to explain all along. "I've spent years upholding a system that didn't take people like you into account," Caldwell continued, his voice softer now. "I never saw it as a flaw, never saw how much damage it could do until now. Until you showed me. I don't know if I can undo the harm that I've caused, but I'm willing to try. I'm willing to listen." Naomi's mind swirled with conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to believe him, wanted to think that maybe there was something genuine in his apology. But another part of her couldn't help but wonder if this was just another attempt to smooth things over, another empty gesture from someone who still didn't fully understand the depth of her pain. She had been hurt before, had trusted the wrong people, had watched as those who promised change failed to deliver. Was she ready to open herself up to that possibility again? "Why?" she asked softly, her voice betraying the exhaustion she felt. "Why now? Why, after everything that's happened, are you suddenly willing to listen?" Caldwell looked up at her, his expression earnest. "Because I've realized something, Naomi," he said, his voice quieter now, almost as though he were speaking to himself. "I've realized that the law isn't just a set of rules. It's supposed to be a reflection of the people it serves. And when I look at people like you, people whose lives are impacted every day by systems that don't see them as equals, I realize that I've failed. And if I've failed, I can't just keep pretending that everything is okay. I can't keep turning a blind eye to the harm." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Naomi was silent. She felt the weight of his apology, the sincerity in his voice, but she still wasn't sure if she could believe him. Trust wasn't something that came easily, especially not after everything she had been through. But the vulnerability in his eyes, the way he had admitted his mistakes, it was something she hadn't expected from him. Naomi finally nodded, a sense of cautious hope flickering in her chest. "I'm not saying it's going to be easy," she said slowly. "But if you really mean what you're saying, if you really want to understand, then we'll have to keep working at it. We'll have to keep talking, keep challenging each other. I won't settle for anything less." Caldwell nodded in agreement, his expression serious. "I understand, and I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy with the weight of the conversation that had just taken place. Naomi had said what she needed to say, and Caldwell had listened. Whether or not this would lead to real change was still uncertain, but it was a start, a beginning. And for the first time in a long time, Naomi felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps they could move forward, not just as collaborators, but as people who were learning and growing together. The days that followed were quieter than Naomi had expected. There was an awkwardness in the air, a tension that lingered between her and Caldwell as they continued their collaboration. The manuscript they had been working on, the one that had once felt like a bridge between two different worlds, now seemed like an ongoing test, a way for them to see if they could truly rebuild what had been fractured. Naomi wasn't sure if it was possible, but she couldn't bring herself to walk away from the project. Not yet. They had agreed to take things slowly, to focus on small steps. Their meetings were still at the library, but now Naomi found herself carefully measuring her words, making sure every sentence was a step in the right direction. She wasn't sure if Caldwell had changed or if he was just saying what she needed to hear. She didn't know if she could trust that he truly understood her pain, but there was something in the way he listened now, in the way he asked questions, that made her believe, at least a little, that maybe he was sincere. It was the third meeting after their confrontation when something shifted. They were sitting in their usual spot, the familiar silence between them, but this time it wasn't awkward. It was different. There was a softness in the way Caldwell looked at her as they talked about their latest chapter, and Naomi found herself letting go of some of the skepticism that had taken root in her heart. They were working through an analysis of race in the criminal justice system, the kind of chapter that had initially felt daunting to Naomi. She had never imagined that someone like Caldwell, a judge, would have any real understanding of the experiences she had lived through. But now he seemed to be grappling with it too, his face furrowing as he processed the words they had written together. "I never realized how deeply this kind of bias runs," Caldwell said quietly, his fingers drumming the edge of his notebook. "I thought I was doing the right thing, following the law. But when I read these words, when I hear your words, it makes me question everything. How many times have I made decisions without thinking about the people behind the cases? How many people have I hurt without even realizing it?" Naomi looked at him, studying his face. For the first time, she saw a man who was truly wrestling with his own role in a broken system, someone who had finally allowed himself to see the reality that so many others, especially Black people, had known all along. It wasn't an easy realization. The kind of awakening Caldwell was going through didn't happen overnight, but Naomi could sense that something in him had shifted. Maybe not everything, but enough for her to believe, for the first time, that their partnership could mean something real. "I can't change the past," Naomi said slowly, her voice soft but firm. "None of us can, but we can keep trying to do better. Every day, every decision. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to happen quickly, but it has to start somewhere." Caldwell nodded, his expression serious. "I want to be part of that change," he said, his voice low. "I want to keep learning. I know I've got a long way to go, but I'm willing to do the work. I'm not asking you to trust me all at once, Naomi. I just want you to know that I'm trying." Naomi's chest tightened. It wasn't a perfect solution. There were no guarantees in life, no assurances that things would be better tomorrow or next week. But in that moment, standing in front of a man who had once been a symbol of the very system she fought against, Naomi saw something she hadn't seen before. She saw a man who was willing to change, who wanted to change. "I can't promise I'll always have faith in you," Naomi said softly, "but I'm willing to keep trying too. We've got something important here, something that can help make a difference, and I won't walk away from it." Caldwell smiled, a faint, almost hesitant smile, but it was real. "Thank you," he said quietly. "We'll keep working at it. Together." For the first time in what felt like ages, Naomi allowed herself to believe that change might be possible. Not just for Caldwell, but for herself too. Maybe they could make something of this after all. Maybe they could make a difference. The weeks that followed their breakthrough felt like an experiment in trust. Naomi and Caldwell continued meeting at the library, and though the air between them was still tinged with the uncertainty of their past, there was a new sense of purpose in the way they worked together. The manuscript had become more than just words on paper. It was now a shared space where both of them were learning, growing, and in some ways, healing. They were still navigating the delicate balance of their professional relationship, but the walls that had once divided them seemed to be slowly coming down. One particularly quiet afternoon, as they sat across from each other with their laptops open, Naomi found herself looking at Caldwell in a way she hadn't before. There was something different about him now. He wasn't just the judge in the courtroom, the person who had the power to impose a fine and ruin lives with a single decision. He was someone who was genuinely trying to understand her experiences, someone who was willing to listen, to question his own assumptions, and to grapple with the weight of the system he had been a part of for so long. Naomi didn't know if she could ever completely trust him. Trust was a long, hard road to travel, but she could see the effort, and that meant something. "I've been thinking a lot about the chapter we're working on," Caldwell said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled over them. "You're right about the way the system is set up. It doesn't just penalize people, it dehumanizes them. I can't keep pretending that what I do doesn't have consequences. I've seen it firsthand now, Naomi, and I don't know how I missed it for so long." Naomi glanced up from her screen, watching him with a mix of wariness and cautious hope. He had said similar things before, but each time she had been unsure whether it was just lip service or a genuine reflection of his changing perspective. Now she wasn't so sure it was the former. There was a weight to his words that suggested he was grappling with something deep within himself. "It's hard," she said after a moment, her voice steady but soft. "I know it's not easy to admit that you've been part of something that causes harm. We all like to think we're doing the right thing, that we're helping people, but sometimes the systems we work within don't actually help. They hurt. They're built on assumptions, on biases, on things that we've been taught to accept as normal. And breaking that down, it takes time. It takes real work." "I'm ready to do that work," Caldwell said, his voice firm now, a tone Naomi hadn't heard before. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness, Naomi. I know that's not something I can expect, not right away, and maybe not ever. But I am asking for the chance to prove to you that I'm different, that I can be part of the solution, not just another piece of the problem." Naomi nodded slowly, absorbing his words. He wasn't asking her to forget the past. He wasn't asking her to ignore the hurt or the deep-seated mistrust she felt. But he was asking for the opportunity to show her that he could change. And while it wasn't easy for her to believe that things could be different, she could sense that he meant it. "We'll see," Naomi replied softly. "Change isn't an event. It's a process. But I'm willing to keep going, to keep working at it. We'll see where it leads." Caldwell didn't respond immediately, but his expression softened, a small, genuine smile creeping onto his face. Naomi couldn't help but feel a flicker of something, a hope that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something different. She wasn't naive enough to believe everything would magically fall into place, but she was beginning to see that the possibility for real change existed. As they continued working, the dynamic between them shifted in ways Naomi hadn't expected. Their conversations became deeper, more reflective. They challenged each other, questioned their assumptions, and at times, even disagreed. But there was a mutual respect now, an understanding that they were no longer operating in isolation. They were partners in this journey, and while their worlds were still starkly different, they were beginning to see each other as allies in a fight for justice. For Naomi, this partnership was more than just a professional endeavor. It was a chance to reclaim her own voice, to be heard by someone who was willing to listen, and to help create something that could, in the end, make a real difference. And for Caldwell, it was a chance to confront his own biases, to become the kind of judge and person he had always wanted to be, a person who saw others not just as cases or numbers, but as human beings with stories, with struggles, and with the capacity for change. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Naomi felt that maybe, just maybe, they were on the right one. The final chapter of their manuscript was due in just a few days, but Naomi and Caldwell had already begun to feel the weight of what they were creating. The journey that had started with a tense and bitter confrontation was now culminating in a shared vision, a piece of work that had the potential to make a difference. They weren't just writing a book anymore, they were building a bridge between two worlds that had once seemed irreparably apart. And somehow, Despite the rough beginning, it felt like they were on the verge of something powerful. It was a Thursday afternoon when they sat in the same library, final edits spread out between them. Naomi was typing the last few lines of a section they had worked through together, her mind buzzing with the content, but her thoughts also drifting toward the larger picture. For the first time in a long time, she felt proud of what they had done. Proud not just of the manuscript itself, but of how far they had come as people. She looked across the table at Caldwell, who was carefully reading through the last chapter, his face reflecting the deep thought that had accompanied every sentence they had written. "You know," Naomi said, breaking the silence between them, "I didn't think I'd be able to trust you again. Not after the fine, not after everything. But here we are, finishing this book together. It feels strange, but in a good way." Caldwell looked up from his papers, his eyes meeting hers with a sincerity she hadn't seen before. "I get it, Naomi, and I'm not asking you to forget what happened. I just wanted to show you that I could change. I could be more than just the judge in that courtroom. I could be someone who listens and learns. And this book, it's more than just about law or the justice system. It's about understanding, empathy, and challenging the things we think we know. It's about change." Naomi nodded slowly, feeling the depth of his words. She had watched him struggle, watched him come to terms with the fact that his past actions didn't align with the ideals he once held so dear. But now she could see the transformation in him, real and raw. He was no longer the man who had handed down a fine without a second thought. He was someone who understood that every decision, every action, impacted real lives. He wasn't perfect, and neither was she, but they were both trying. And that effort, her effort, his effort, felt like the beginning of something monumental. "I think we've done it," Naomi said quietly, her fingers still resting on the keys of her laptop. "I think we've actually created something that might matter. Something that could help people." Caldwell smiled, but it wasn't the same smile from the past, the one that was polite, reserved, and guarded. This smile was genuine, a quiet acknowledgement of the hard work they had put in and the journey they had both taken to get to this point. "I hope so," he said. "I really hope so. We've spent so much time writing about a system that's broken, about the people it harms. But in this book, maybe we found a way to help fix it, even if it's just one person at a time." Naomi let out a breath, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. She hadn't expected to feel this way about Caldwell, not after everything. But there was something about the way he had tried to make amends, about the sincerity in his actions, that allowed her to believe in the possibility of redemption. She hadn't just healed from the wounds he had caused. She had seen him heal, too. In the process, they had both become better versions of themselves. As they reviewed the final pages, Naomi realized that they were no longer two people from completely different worlds. They had found common ground, not just in their work, but in their understanding of each other's humanity. They had built something together, not just a book, but a connection. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't be easy to keep building on it, but in that moment, Naomi felt something that had been missing for years: hope. "I guess this is it," Naomi said with a smile, closing her laptop. "We've done it. We've finished." Caldwell stood up, extending his hand across the table to her. It was a simple gesture, but in it there was a sense of finality and respect. Naomi reached out, shaking his hand firmly. There was no need for more words. No need to dwell on the past or what might come next. For now, this moment, this achievement, was enough. "I couldn't have done it without you," Caldwell said, his voice warm. "Thank you, Naomi." Naomi looked up at him, her eyes steady and her heart full. "No thank you," she replied, "for listening, for learning, for trying." And as they left the library that afternoon, each of them carrying a manuscript that was a symbol of their shared journey, Naomi realized that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships, those born of tension, conflict, and uncertainty, could create the most meaningful change.